We're living in an era where people are finding their own autonomy and their own agency, and they want to express that. We're not content anymore just to hand all of that over to someone else. It doesn't have to mean separation from others or selfishness, or sometimes people interpret that as meaning I want this for myself. With the tools that we have now, it could mean I want this for everyone. We should all be able to co-create this space rather than be leaving it to any one small group of people. And then there's the planetary thing. What are we doing today that has a direct impact upon the planet? Again, people think if it's individual and it's local or community driven, then it has no relationship to the planet. But in fact, that's completely the opposite. It's from your felt place where you are that you can make decisions upon that directly affect the planet.
For episode 40, my guest is Indra Adnan, who is co-initiator of the Alternative UK, part of a global network of political platforms originating with Alternative in Denmark. Her commitment is to grassroots politics that release the power of people and communities in ways that sustain the planet. She is a journalist, a psychotherapist, founder of the Soft Power Network, Buddhist, futurist, school governor, and mother. I feel that the Alternative is the platform that we really need right now, and speaking to Indra always leaves me inspired and energized for our flourishing and beautiful future. This episode marks a year since we first launched the show, and nearly 9 since this project was born. I want to thank all of you for your support. We have an amazing team, guests, patrons, and global community that each day inspire me and help me to shift my way of understanding the world that we live in. Thank you for your radical commitment to a beautiful future. Part of what I love about doing this show is that we go deep. It's not all positivity and optimism, and yet being with this podcast for a year has renewed my sense of faith in humanity and the possibility we have within our grasp. In this episode, we discuss why we need to focus on the deeper issues of our time, how we are beyond political party divides, the role of core values like courage and empathy, and the role of the feminine in a flourishing future. Indra has been a great friend and mentor to me this past year in particular, showing me ways to navigate the challenges that many women in a political sphere face at this time, and widening my perspective in every conversation of how to make sense of our role at this time and the challenges inherent in it. With the wildfires in California, an extinction rebellion launching in the UK, the pressure upon us to find a new way is illuminated, and we need to radically step up, demand more from our politics, put down our distractions, and wake up. This conversation offers us an understanding of how to do this, which is relevant no matter where you are. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Ghadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by Indra Adnan, who is the initiator of a new movement called The Alternative. Hi, Indra.
Hi, Amisha.
Thank you for welcoming me into your home today.
Oh, great pleasure.
So can we just go straight in to what is the Alternative?
Yeah, first of all, I don't really call it a movement yet. It may be a movement, but what it is right now is a political platform. So if you can think of physically a platform, that's what it is. It's something that we put lots of different projects and initiatives on. And there's a number of things on this political platform, but the intention of it is that it should give rise to a new politics. The opening question is, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And that's a huge question. Kicks off with, in this country, only 2% of people are, are members of political parties. I mean, that's enough really to kick off a huge debate, investigation, exploration. Why are only 2% of people members of political parties? Does that mean that the whole political discourse as we know it comes from that 2%? Is our media feeding off that 2%? What do we really know about politics other than what's coming out of that political bubble? And what we're trying to do is open up the 98% and think of what other kind of politics could arise from that.
It's also amazing that actually that percentage has doubled, because when I started this project, and in the book, in the introduction of the Future is Beautiful book, it's 1%. So amazingly, it has doubled somehow over the last 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think what people are really shocked by is that with the whole Corbyn surge, and I appreciate that you're putting quite a positive spin on that, and I'll go with that, right? But it's still quite shocking to think that with the whole Corbyn surge, with everything that happened with Scottish independence, and also what was for a moment a green surge that happened during the last election, add all of those things up, and if you read the papers, you'd think everybody's gone Corbyn crazy, or everybody in Scotland is a member of the SNP, but it's absolutely not true. It's just a tiny percentage of people that all the news is about. And this isn't just true for the UK, it's true for Europe as well. I mean, across the whole of Europe, the average is 5%.
Wow.
Yeah, it's shocking.
And the UKIP surges too, like the
and
surges
UKIP,
on both
of course.
sides.
Yeah, and UKIP, of course, that's included.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's tiny.
It's tiny. And then you have to ask, questions like, so what is democracy then? Who's creating this shared agency or power in this country? Most people aren't involved at all. And that looks like a sort of a space of objection and annoyance or anger, but actually it's the opposite. When you step outside of the bubble and you decide not to be driven by that set of narratives anymore, and you start to actively explore what's happening outside of that space. And I don't just mean whatever's happening in people's lives. I could pick up the Daily Mail for that or something. But what is social political, small p political, outside of that bubble? What are people doing that will make a difference to their community? What are people doing that makes a difference to, the lived experience for people? What are people doing that makes a difference to the environment? That's existing outside of that bubble, not getting reported by our media. And it's masses. It's masses. It's so much that we are able to blog every single day on a new initiative that is appearing outside of that bubble. Real human ingenuity in those initiatives. I mean, it's changed my life, to be honest. It's changed the quality of my life, standing outside of that bubble and looking outwards at all the other stuff that's going on that doesn't get reported.
It's so inspiring, and then it triggers something in me.
Go.
Which is that having myself been part of the bubble and worked in politics and given up many a Saturday working on campaigns and projects and conferences and being in those discussions, and then getting frustrated at the same kind of narrative and not finding a space for a wider narrative, wanting more participation, which is what led me to this project, all about the small p politics. The people that I was politically connected to have never really appreciated the work that I've done in the small p politics and the work that happens as being part of politics. I do find that frustrating. Not that it's not my work being recognised, but just this lack of understanding. There are two kinds of politics happening. This small p politics is very alive. And like you said, there are so many people that I could interview on this. And this podcast, for example, and there are so many people who have ideas, projects, and the way that they're living are shaping our communities and our future. And yet they're not seen. And I do get frustrated by that.
It's a joy to be talking to you and seeing what you do, right? Because for me, it's like watching popcorn it's been lying on the bottom of a pan for a bit, and now it's heating up, and now it's rising to the surface, right? And it's a waking up. We're in a waking up era, in my view, when, and I sometimes call it a revolution. Since about 20 years now that we've been able to have different access to information, different access to each other, we're becoming aware of the limitedness of what was happening before. It's early days yet, relatively, historically, it's early days, but what you and I are both seeing is going to become increasingly obvious to everybody else. And I would say, even for me, the sort of, the moment, where I jumped ship, from one thing to another, was just before Brexit. I mean, I should mention here that the mothership, if you like, is the political party called Alternative in Denmark, who I had been watching for some time from where I was working within this progressive think tank called Compass, who are my dear friends and always will be. But that's where I was, and Compass is part of the political scene, so working very much with, and I should say probably on the 2%, trying to open up that space. And I wrote a paper called Is the Party Over?, looking at why political parties are so dysfunctional. And there were many reasons, cultural, structural, what kind of experience they gave their members. There were many things lacking. And I wrote this paper, and as I wrote it, I became aware of all these new political parties that were springing up around Europe, who were experimenting with new ways of connecting with more people, new ways of political behavior, new kind of structures. And the one that most excited me was the Alternative in Denmark. And the reason for that is that it's founded by somebody called Uffe Elbæk, who was not a career politician at all. He started out as a social worker, in fact, so that's his expertise and his capacity. But then he went on to become the founder of something called Chaos Pilots, who's teaching young people mostly to be capable of the 21st century in the future, literally how to pilot the chaos. And it was a lot to do with entrepreneurship and how to be effective in a socio-political way. His whole emphasis is on human and social capacity. And then he was pulled into the political scene. He became culture minister for the Social Liberal Party. But he was only there for a year before he, got so impatient with all the limitations of politics, as you know. And then he jumped ship and founded the Alternative. And he started off with this kind of empty vessel, meaning it had no political program at all. It had a manifesto that was based on 6 values. He just held those values at the core of everything. And then he opened up political laboratories around Denmark to crowdsource the political program. He's been doing that for 5 years now. They were voted in immediately. They got 9 seats in their first election. It's proportional in Denmark, so we wouldn't have the same situation here. But he's just said, I'm going to try this. He could see the limitedness of politics. He was really focused on what the political party could be like, needs to be like, which is to be serving the people rather than trying to lead them. I could go into that a bit more later on. That's the experiment that I then saw and wanted to have some of. And then spending time with the Alternative, as I did do in Denmark over a number of occasions, just the energy of it and the infectious behavior and the emphasis on humour and warmth and human connection and dance, and it was just alive. And this aliveness is what I feel is essential to any democratic exercise, because if people don't want to be part of what you're doing, if it doesn't attract them, then they won't buy into it, and then it can't become something properly participative, and then it can't be something that is properly democratic. So making politics attractive and a good visceral experience for people is part of your obligation, I think, as somebody who's active in politics, and that's what we're trying to do.
And also a way of capturing and catching and using the energy that exists, because say after Brexit, I and like many people were like, what's going on? Okay, I need to get more involved in mainstream politics again. And I was part of Compass on their youth committee for many years. And, you know, I called them and I called everyone I knew that still worked in politics. And I was like, okay, I want to do something. What can I do? And I didn't really understand where that energy could go. I mean, it could have gone into Corbyn and into that whole movement, but I was kind of looking for something else, and I didn't find it. And I felt that a lot of friends that had never been political but suddenly wanted to be didn't quite know where to go with that energy. And that's really sad, because it's not just about attracting energy, it's also that there is a lot of energy, but it needs a vessel.
Absolutely. So the energy part is the bit that we feel, or that we experience straight away, that we're attracted to. But there's a reason for that different energy being present. And we've kind of pinpointed it to three specific things. And the core of it is, the first point is that, you know, the idea of what a human being is at the heart of politics, in the old politics, is Homo economicus. It's the idea of a human being as, number one, needing material things, after which other needs can be built, right? So it's sort of Maslow's hierarchy kind of idea. And what we're saying is, no, from the word go, you know, from the minute you emerge from the womb, you are a complex biopsychosocial spiritual entity. Always need to get these complex needs met from the beginning. And in fact, getting the emotional, spiritual, biological needs met as well helps you to get your material needs met. So you can't separate them all out from each other. So this kind of new understanding of who's the human being at the heart of politics opens it up immediately into something that isn't all just about the economy and, you know, about figures and about measurements. No, it's got to be about, you know, what causes human flourishing right from the word go. You can then understand why those people with those concerns in a room are going to be more energetic and more answering their different calls and just being more human than people who are just focused on the material, economic aspect of human existence. You know, it's like right from the start. And then the second thing we look at is that, or that we identified as like specifically different, is this comes directly from Brexit, really underlined it, which is that we're living in an era where people are finding their own autonomy and their own agency, and they want to express that. We're not content anymore just to hand all of that over to someone else. When people were given the chance to vote on something, and they were called upon emotionally, do you want more control over your lives, right? That's people who weren't part of that, you know, who weren't vulnerable and feeling disempowered. Maybe that didn't mean anything. Maybe they felt they already had control over their lives. But there are a significant number of people, 52% of people, for whom that was a real call. You know, a sense of, I need more control over my life. Of course, we all know there was no way that the people who are offering it to them could give them more control over their lives. That wasn't really part of the equation. What was significant was that they responded to that call. You know, I think that that's important. It has to be reflected in politics. We need to think about our shared agency and our autonomy. You know, there's an increasing call for autonomy. It doesn't have to mean separation from others or selfishness, or sometimes people will interpret that as meaning I want this for myself. With the tools that we have now, it could mean I want this for everyone. You know, we should all be able to co-create this space rather than be leaving it to any one small group of people. And then there's the planetary thing, which is that what are we doing today that has a direct impact upon the planet? So again, people think if it's individual and it's local or community driven, then it has no relationship to the planet. But in fact, that's completely the opposite. It's from your felt place where you are that you can make decisions upon, you know, that directly affect the planet, whether it's an energy decision or a food decision. It's a cultural decision. You know, you can see the direct impact it's going to have on the planet, and why shouldn't you want to be part of that? We call that the I, we, world sort of backbone of our politics. And it's not three separate realms. It's the fact that we all have those three realms within us, right? So you have a individual self, you know, a you-ness and a Amisha-ness. You also have a social self where you're part of community and you act like you're part of community. And then you have your global citizen self where you can be responsible as an individual for the whole planet. You can make decisions but on that basis. You know, this idea that the individual is somehow a contradiction to the socials. Not, I don't believe that's true, but then I've been a Buddhist for 30 years, so it's easy for me.
And then that understanding that what you do as an individual has an impact on the we and the world, and that's inescapable in the way that the world's built right now. Yeah,
that's right. But also then, if you don't see the connection backwards as well, that what happens at the global level and what happens at the community level has to satisfy you at the personal level as well. And I don't mean satisfy you and then I get what I want, but it has to be meeting your needs, you know, your material and your emotional needs. Yeah, I think it's fair enough. Having missed that in the past, I think has led to these crises of depression and addiction and crime, because, you know, the needs of the individual are somehow put second to the needs of the economy, for example.
And I like what you say about human flourishing, and, you know, sometimes the way that politics is portrayed in the media kind of strips out any sense of humanness about it. And it's almost like, you know, you might notice if a policy dramatically negatively affects your ability to flourish, but you don't notice so much if it just makes it a little bit harder, because a lot of them make it a little bit harder or a little bit easier, or depending on where you are. Taking that step back, like, why are we here? Are we really here to have a nice job in an office, pay a mortgage, and then children die? Or is there a more flourishing aspect?
Absolutely.
And a friend of mine just was visiting this weekend that had just been to stay in Gabon with a tribe. It's not that tribes have all the answers, but what he said that struck me was that because in the community everything's taken care of, so there's a place to live, there's food to eat, there's childcare, because there's a sense of kind of sharing the children and everyone looking after the children, that people had an opportunity to flourish into what their thing was, you know, whether it was their music, to play the most exquisite music because they weren't worrying about how they were going to pay the bills, or they weren't playing their music after working 10 hours doing a job that they didn't like. And that also this idea of, you know, okay, where's the next meal? So people were taking care of that. So there were people that were very good at doing that. And so whatever it was that needed to happen in the community was happening. Whereas our lifestyles are there's just so many things, and, you know, we have it easy, but there's so many things in a day to kind of think about, making sure that this is paid and that's paid and this is done and this person's looked after and this and this, and then when do you have time to flourish within all of that?
You know, immediately as I'm listening to you, I'm hearing the usual cacophony of it's fine in a community in Gabon because X, and X. You know, if you were to bring that over here as a principle, who pays for it? You know, I think that's very real, but also this is why I think we're in such a really unique time, is because if we look at the future, we'll see that there's every possibility that we can be released into that open space because of the advances in technology. You know, whether it's artificial intelligence or automation, we are moving into a future where so much of the work that we're doing now that has made slaves of us, all right, will be done by, well, I'm not necessarily going to call it robots, but let's say by technology of one form or another, of which some of it may be robotic, right? And that's the fruits of human ingenuity, right? So what we're only emerging from is the Industrial Revolution. And I think history will show that to have been the era of hard power. Everything's clunky. Human beings are sort of slaves to something that's trying to emerge. We live lives that are not human because we're in service to something that's apparently bigger than us. But as a result of that, all of that hard work in the 20th century, something else is now threatening to come through, right? And we should be really looking forward to that age that should liberate us. But it won't liberate us unless we are consciously taking control of it now. Because it could be, we're sort of at a point where it could be just taken away by the elites and the huge divide occurs, and the people who are slaves now could become more slavish in the future, and the people who are who are relatively free now will be so free. But this huge divide could happen over the next 50 years. Or the very thing that's happening now, which is people beginning to take back control of their own destinies, could mean that this could go well, which is what I love from your book. It's so evocative. The future is beautiful. If you have it in your mind that it's possible the future could be beautiful, I think then, we've got something to really work together for and to ask how that's possible. But what I find in a lot of political work and language is they can't move out of the 20th century, right? So as much as their yearning and longing for a good society is there, they're still very fixated on jobs and labor and material needs and so on. And they can't make the leap, into the future that we really require now, which needs us to imagine that we're going to be much freer and have much more time on our hands than we currently have. We should be really thinking actively now about what to do with that time. And there's so much we could be doing with that time. Some of it's the beautiful stuff that you just described, but also there's a huge part called, active citizenship. How can we all begin to take responsibility for each other in ways that we haven't done before, and in ways that is glorious, flourishing? We should never be afraid of having more time on our hands. That's what's in front of us, and that's what we have to be really pushing for, I think. And so when we talk about a new politics, so we have this I-we world, and then the other factor is the future. Let's play into the future, because a lot of the answers and the scarcity that we've had to deal with in the 20th century may not be there in the 21st or the rest of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. And also with that, there's an education in making sure that we are able to utilize the technology that's coming in a way that's helpful, as well as thinking of what we do with that extra time, so that it doesn't get kind of taken just by the elite, that we all have access to it whilst it's available.
Exactly. And I think that's what can happen at the local level. Right. If we're trying to negotiate all of that at the national level, it's very hard. There should be a policy the national level needs to guarantee and protect the work that's going on at the local level. But how a local community, whether it's at the town level or the municipal level, decides it wants to spend its own money on making life easier for people, whether or not they want to, have their own 3D printers, for example, or whether they want to start having vertical farming structures, for example, or different kind of power, different kind of energy sources, of which there's so many choices now, but there's an issue around the national grid. These decisions could be made at the local level, because then people have some buy-in to them. They have some relationship with it. They feel they own it. Then they can be getting their emotional needs met for belonging and meaning and purpose. All these sorts of things start to come from that, while changing the national ways of working. Mm-hmm. Some people will say that makes it very postcode lottery. There's some truth in that. There needs to be some sort of federalization process whereby everybody has the right to make those decisions. But first, the call and the demand for it needs to come from below. I always like to start with courage, because I think even imagining a space like that and finding your voice, to see courage on the wall reminds you, and we tend to put the values up on the wall in all of our events, reminds you that it's difficult for everyone to find their voice. And more than that, it's very challenging to have a vision that goes beyond the usual vision. And I'm not trying to demote the usual vision either, because of course having equality and rights for everyone remains absolutely fundamental. But to be able to step out further than that and imagine a society beyond work, for example, or a society in which people have more time, which is something different from simply having enough resources, it takes courage to start to go into those spaces.
Absolutely.
So courage is a very important factor.
It's really come up actually on this podcast in so many of the interviews. Like, what is it that we need? And courage being that thing that we need to develop in ourselves in order to be able to create something more beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the plus roles of social media, is that people can share their deep feelings, or they can share their unexpected visions, so that they're already existing out there and people can pull on them. But for people to be able to say, and that includes people with privilege, that I've never really lived a life that fulfills me or satisfies me, it takes some courage, because we all know that in the bigger picture of things, we're lucky here. Yeah, courage takes all sorts of forms. And then the second thing is generosity. And generosity of spirit, again, is incredibly important for things to start to move, because we're all pretty locked into our own idea of the rights and wrongs. And it's hard to accept that people have a very different perspective on the reality from you. And sometimes, especially again, going back into this situation of clashes of culture or clashes of class. Let's take, for example, class differences. To imagine that there is problems on both sides that need to be fixed, or yearning coming from both people on the left and people on the right, for example, requires a generosity of spirit. So hear me out. Hear me out. That's where the generosity comes in. The third thing is humility. So many of us who are leading projects are always harboring this sense that we know what needs to happen. But the big issue is that we've never really heard from the people on whom the impact of our actions is most felt. So putting ourselves aside and hearing from them is kind of the secret to unlocking what we have to offer. There's no point in offering a solution that can't be engaged with or heard or adopted by the people, the most people who are going to be using those things. The humility of idea is just one part. Action is the more important part. The ability to put something into process is the more important part. So put yourself aside. The idea was just the starting point. What comes after that is much more important. Transparency is really a political ideal. The idea that we should all be able to see how we act, who we are, and so on. I think it's more important. I think what we're trying to bring out, and in Denmark too, is openness. Our own transparency to ourselves is very important. Sometimes we use the word openness rather than transparency. I think empathy is a more commonly understood term, the idea that you are able to stand in another person's shoes. But it's also, I feel, bandied about as if people take for granted that they're empathetic. It's something you have to work on all the time to really, at crucial moments, when you really think you've sorted it out, to have empathy for the people who don't agree with you is crucial. And that may be one of the biggest things in our current divides, that we've been set up to have these divides. That's been the dynamics of our politics. Where does empathy lead us? What is the role of empathy if we're setting up a system in which the binary is what drives it, where the energy is? Yeah. It's sort of contradictory.
And in an environment that can actually be quite aggressive, it's much harder to cultivate empathy and to keep showing up with empathy. Whereas it's easier to be empathetic in other situations.
No, absolutely. And also empathy looks soft, or it looks as if it will lead us nowhere. Whereas actually it's the key to unlocking everything. So I agree with you. Politics is uniquely bad for that. We can go out into our local community and have a generally empathetic stance, and then we'll meet whoever it is who's on the opposite side of your divide. Instantly this sort of clarity about I'm not with them comes into and empathy just goes out the window at that point.
Yeah.
Often for those of us who are quite rooted actually in human development and humanistic principles, there's still a sort of gate, or fence over which we won't climb when it comes to people not like us. I don't think there's ever a threshold, really. You have to keep deepening your empathy because that's the key to us being able to relate to others. And then we've got humour. It's maybe the most important of all of them, because if we can't feel some commonality, if we can't laugh at the same things, if there isn't a level of humour that could unite us, then we're pretty lost, actually. And we have to work on that, because quite often the humour develops in a way that really takes advantage of the other. I've seen, just to say humour properly isn't enough. It's quite a determined, humour, I suppose, that lifts us all equally, or that's going to be shared. Do you let humour into your life? Do you have humour in your life? Does something you pursue? Or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise everything gets really serious. And, because of what I care about in the world, there is a propensity to be serious. I try with everything to laugh as much as possible and to keep close to me the people with whom I laugh very easily.
Exactly. That's a good point. And I've been to a couple of laughing workshops with, really skeptical. But the physiology of laughing, is the thing that will keep you going. Yeah. Literally, it changes your way of being in the world. So now I'm being serious about humour, which is not acceptable.
But also on a political level, growing up with Spitting Image on TV, and then so you would watch the news and then you would watch Spitting Image, which was a very clever, hilarious satire show that featured all of the politicians. Of course, satire goes with the taking the piss out of people, so it's not the most empathetic form of humour.
Yeah.
But it definitely would take the pedestal away of politics.
Yeah.
It actually made it more approachable somehow, that you could actually see the shadow as well, and you could laugh through the shadow of what existed.
Yeah. Listen, we could now do a podcast on humour, and I think, and I really recommend that you do one, because I now when I'm thinking about it in terms of the thick of it, or they're actually very strong weapons, in fact, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm not, and they're not neutral, in fact. It's the same as when we talk about the power of the arts. It's the same thing. Arts do lift people's spirits, but they can really be manipulative too. Again, it opens up another huge conversation, but that paradoxical nature of to be human, is present in everything, in politics. And I think that's why, for me, the most beautiful capturing of humour is in that kind of Buddhist smile. So if you're looking at an authentic statue of a Buddha, it has that little smile playing on the lips of the Buddha, right? Where that entity has lifted itself above the human drama and is looking at it and thinking, humans, what a laugh, look at the games they play, look at the way they behave. And it really helps to do that, and have that smile, or some people think of it as the Mona Lisa, the Gioconda smile. It's like, you have to do, for sure. It's when we get into these really tough battles between ourselves and each other, the rabbit holes that we disappear down. At some point, you've got to be able to say, just look at us fighting. Just look at what we're doing now. We could be doing something else.
Absolutely. I mean, even just with my own kind of patterns, I laugh quite a lot when I'm like, oh, I just did that again. I remember a therapist I worked with several years ago just saying, at least you know how to laugh at yourself.
Yeah.
and I've taken that with me, and that's definitely been a very helpful factor.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can get so caught up in your own story as well.
Yeah.
And in the stories that we're in, and they can become impossible.
Yeah. That's it, I think, Amisha. For me, to bring that level of, what's the right word for it? It's not attachment, it's not detachment, it's like non-attachment to what we're doing that frees us up to take action. And maybe that's a really good moment to sort of think about this particular moment we're in, which is to look at, all these political battles that are going on, and then to stand back from that and say, look at all this, small battles that we're in the face of the much larger battle that we're kind of ignoring, which is the climate issue, which affects us all. And how can we step away from the smaller ones to come together, and then becomes the real opportunity of mankind, if you like, and the global society to work together on the thing that we all urgently need to address. That ability to stand back from the small things is more and more crucial right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. When some of the big things that we have that we're going to have to face as humanity, climate change, possibility of nuclear war, and technological advances, artificial intelligence, these things are all coming.
Yeah.
They're all being developed. Things are happening.
Yeah.
And how much of our attention is going there? Actually, our attention is being put onto Brexit and these kind of things that aren't helping us to deal with those issues.
Yeah, exactly. So distraction is our problem. Attention is our opportunity. And a lot of people are talking about that. They are talking about the economy of attention, the attention economy. There has to be a focus and a practice of that within politics, as opposed to, within mindfulness classes all over the country where people are doing it for themselves. I'm not dismissing that being important. It's a first step training for us, right? But we have to bring that right into the heart of politics. What are the most important issues now? How do we use all of our resources? And actively, how do we overcome our divisions? Because unless we do that, we just can't rise to the moment. And rising is the point.
It's like filtering out the noise, which when you learn how to meditate or something for yourself, you're learning how to work with just the complete storm of thoughts that are coming through, and kind of you're learning to sort of discern and be able to find your inner wisdom and to create more space. And that's what we need to be doing on a bigger scale, like working out what's noise and what do we really need to be paying attention to, and where can we really rise up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be that right now there's a sort of, I obviously hesitate to use the word, but there's like an army of capable people getting themselves into position for doing just that, and being able to move into, for example, community spaces, and with a real sense of how do we create the conditions for communities to self-organize, what needs to be done now to make that happen, and how do we hold those spaces in a subtle enough way to allow people in all their diversity to feel included in that. I think this is the job of the people who for the last 10 years have been training themselves to do that work you've just described. So, and it's not easy to sell that as an idea, because a lot of those people have created the space for themselves to do that with the idea in their head that they're stepping away from the fray, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm going on a retreat, or I'm developing my own lifestyle, or I'm finding the others who are like me, and we're sharing these practices. And it could look like a separate Buddha's land, if you like, or land of spiritual pursuit. And it could look very separate from what we're reading about that's happening on the front line. And I'm beginning to challenge that and say, it's you that must bring your skills onto the front line. It's you that must work in communities with people who are excluded and left behind, because it's you that have developed these skills to be able to hold these complex spaces. And it's not often a very popular thing, because people have actually wanted to escape from that.
I hear you. And I feel slightly challenged by it too, because there is that sense. I think what it's triggered in me is that actually I know I've done this, a kind of walking away, because I can't deal with this anymore. It's not going anywhere. I'm walking away. I'm creating something new.
Yeah.
And then actually that being, I don't know how to explain it, but there's something superficial in that, because it's about creating a kind of safe place of a safe bubble where things are a certain way and nothing else kind of infiltrates it. And then that creates more separation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sort of where we are right now. These are the conditions, where the people who've deepened and, in a sense, finessed their own sense of self are almost living on another planet from the people who haven't had a chance to do that.
A lot of them are in Bali, having a really nice time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they literally leave to find the others. And I think it's been a very necessary journey. I'm not decrying that in any sense. But I'm beginning to say more and more, in this moment, that we cannot deny the planet is burning. And in this moment where the skills of those who can hold diversity and can be generous and empathetic, interestingly multi-layered, they've been through their own self-development, this whole arena of adult development that we talk about quite often, the integral principle or approach to life. Surely you become the very people who could do the difficult work of bringing people together now, because you yourself have been on that journey. You yourself now contain multitudes, and you know that. It's not that you're required to be the leaders. On the contrary, you're required to be the post-egoic, facilitators of these spaces. It really puts all that work to good use, in my view, at a moment of emergency. It's a challenge, yeah. I'm seeing that as partly my challenge to the people I've spent so much of my life with, developing our inner strength. So now that we have this inner strength, how do we put it to use for everyone, particularly those who haven't had that chance? We haven't got another 25 years to go on the slow journey of everybody doing that. What has to happen is some people have to hold the space for others, so that wherever you are on that journey, you can still find your part of the action that needs to be taken now.
Yes. I'm not sure what it looks like, but yes.
Yeah. It's almost faceless work. I mean, I think the most difficult part of it is that you have to be almost, not entirely, but almost ready to be anonymous in that work. And it reminds me a little bit of the way women have nearly always operated with their particular skills and wiring, on the margins or in society, holding things together and not being paid for that. So it's familiar. It's familiar work amongst women. But for that kind of skill and operation to now be what happens in the public space as well, and that is a politics, and that a politics arises from that. That's a whole new era that we're moving into, in my view. I'm not saying men can't do the work too, but they have to honor that it's this kind of work now that really needs to be done. Otherwise, you've got this further polarized world on the horizon. I mean, extremely polarized, where a lot of the good people who've had access, who've been to Bali, could become part of the, distant elite now. Especially if they have access to, the science, the technology, the substances that will take them ever higher. The gap will be exponentially growing in these next 5 years. Or those very gifted people can use their skills where they're most needed to help bring people together.
Yeah, there's a real urgency. like, I'm a bit lost for words, if I'm honest, because I'm really resonating so much with what you're saying. It's making me have to reorganize like everything that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Just in this moment, I'm like going, okay, like that's a whole different way of thinking about this. And actually, more recently, I've been doing a lot in these kind of creating these communities, leading in these communities that are the opposite of that are bubble oriented. It's like, come over here and learn these skills, be with like-minded people. And I've got quite burnt twice this year on those kinds of projects, and actually had a much more fulfilling experience in a community that I just happen to actually physically live in. So I live in a tower block in Hackney, so similar to Grenfell Towers, which for people around the world will have seen what one of these tower blocks looks like. And there's over 100 apartments in mine. It's been a really beautiful experience living there and getting to know everyone. It's like a vertical village. You're literally living on top of each other. And we have some challenges that we have to face ourselves, such as a management company that doesn't want to contribute to the works going on in the building, and phone masks that are being put on the building and no profits coming into the upkeep of the impact that they're having, all of these kind of things. And that sort of brought us together as a group of people. I'm constantly inspired by how much effort and energy people are putting in. One example was that we have a concierge. It's not like a kind of fancy top hat concierge.
Brass buttons. Yeah.
But we had an amazing guy who had been part of the building for something like 30 years, and he got retired. He has no family. It's going to be very difficult for him to get work again. The building have really, really rallied around him. So we threw him a party, we all put money in. So many people turned up because those little moments of saying hi to him, like every day for the years, had added up. And actually, people from the building started going, okay, how can we help him to apply for housing? How can we help him to be getting the right benefits? He's lost his phone. Who's got one? How can we set up like a rota of keeping him in our lives?
God, how beautiful.
It was so beautiful. And I was really touched by it. And actually, the generosity in that is completely different to the generosity present in these more spiritual, lifestyle, value-based, intentional communities that I've witnessed. And it's not to say that they're all like that, or it's not a generalization, but that's just been my experience of this past year. And I think there's something in the people that are naturally around you. You do have a vested interest in living harmoniously with, in working together with, and you're not in a consumerist kind of pick and choose mentality. I mean, you are in a sense that, you could be like, well, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm going to try and move. But it's not that you're just there and you're kind of buying into that because you like the vibe, and then when you don't like the vibe, you'll go and buy into another one. And it's really like you're rooted into that.
Yeah.
And I think that brings something else out in us.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really great story. And it reminds me that you can have these spaces in so many different forms, and to have the one that you live in as your essential community is really where you're probably going to do your best work, actually, as you say, because you're being confronted by it every day, you have an interest in it being happy. But also the thing that really strikes me is the way you describe other people's input, because that's the very thing that I feel is really missing in politics, is this idea that people have so much input to give. People are so instrumentalized by politics. They're seen as units or the voters. They're not really seen as people with all of this potential and all of this possible creativity, or warmth, and all the stuff that you're describing are the most important resources we have for getting past this point. And the real triumph, in the bad way, of the past has been to separate us all so we can't access these things about our collective selves. The revolutionary thing is to overcome that. So even to make a friend of someone that you wouldn't normally make a friend of is an act of defiance against this culture of division that we've, sort of almost not noticed happening throughout our lifetimes, but increasingly, I would have said, in the last 10, 20 years, where we've just all become economic units relating to each other through the marketplace. And it's robbed us of our seeing ourselves as relational beings. And that our joy, the joy that you describe from it, is what's on offer. And we're missing out on it, mostly. And politics definitely doesn't see it as our resource or the most important resource. It's missing out on that altogether. So, yeah, I love that story. I mean, I do think that when it comes to those spiritual communities...
Or political communities.
No, I think those are probably two quite different things. But if the spiritual community is where people are coming to go inwards, then it's kind of understandable that that's what they should be talking about, is their inner journey. I think the one you were describing is slightly different, where it's supposed to be a coming together of people, and sometimes they can't make the journey from inner to outer. And so it can easily end up being a lot of egos competing with each other in that space, or people thinking their needs are more important than somebody else's needs, or, it's almost as if the culture of it isn't developed enough yet. But stepping outside of that, what you just was described has always been available to us. It's almost as if we hardly needed to. Well, maybe we can only talk about it this way because we've been on our journeys. Maybe we could never have appreciated it before the way we can appreciate it now.
And the world has changed significantly in a very short space of time. And so when I think of just growing up, people were just starting to travel the world. It wasn't such a thing as it is now. The world wasn't as interconnected as it is now. We're responding to that, but obviously the fact that we are online more, the fact that we can travel more has had an impact in how we invest in what's physically around us. And that's sort of normal with those kinds of advances, that things would get neglected, which brings us to, okay, well, what's advancing now and what do we want to be careful not to neglect at this stage so that in 20 years we're not saying the same thing?
Absolutely.
Where actually what we're talking about is something really simple that our parents and our grandparents were doing.
Yeah.
Talking to their neighbours.
Yeah, exactly. And how did we lose that? I guess we lost it in the collective narrative that nothing matters more than growth of the economy. And that's the thing I think that, much of politics has slowly become aware of, that is a problematic overarching narrative, and that it is destroying our planet, right? So maybe we're in a moment where the mainstream politics at least can't avoid that anymore. And so questions of relentless growth are properly in focus. And they certainly are in places like the United Nations or in NGOs, but even in mainstream politics, both on the left and the right, I have to say, there's some acceptance of that now. But in the meantime, communities have lost their ability. So when you're talking about your parents used to, and I know that my parents, when they were living in their respective homes, like where they were born, they used to have those community relations. But certainly the ability to have that is pretty scarce now. People live very atomized lives. They're stressed out, working 10 hours a day. There isn't space for people to have those relationships. In the bigger picture, we might be moving into that in the future, with more time on our hands, with automation and technology providing that. But still, we have to be trying to develop that. I'm hearing every day, as I'm sure you are, that there's a lot of fear around whether what we can do with our time, we're just going to be consuming more and watching more television and getting out of our heads more. And how could that be a good thing for humanity? So to win the argument at the community level, that there's so much to do here to build this community that doesn't exist, and that will be a fulfilling thing emotionally and physically, and also will have material consequences, is the prize that we need to somehow find a way to identify and turn into the mainstream narrative. I think that's what George Monbiot is trying to do. There are others like him who are thinking this will be the time of our greatest productiveness, but it won't be at all in the same way as we've been productive in the past. And that's what we're trying to really clarify, crystallize that narrative for a new politics.
And so on a practical level, what are the things that the alternative does?
3 things. We produce a daily alternative, which is our media outlet. We do active work trying to identify people like us who are working in similar ways and connect us up, because we're all working in silos. And then the third way is to develop community spaces, which we call collaboratories, where very diverse communities can come together and begin a process of moving through what we call the 3 stages. The first one being the friendly stage, where people literally are meeting each other for the first time. The inquiry stage, where those same people start to inquire into what their community is, what's good about it, what's lacking in it, how it could be better. And then the action phase, where those ideas can take concrete form. As a result of us building what we're calling citizens networks that didn't exist before, people coming into relationship with each other, should lead to concrete actions. And those actions should be very appropriate to that town or city or regions. I don't really like the word resilience, and I don't even particularly like the word sustainability, but it should be contributing to their own vision of flourishing, even in this crucial moment. That should be what's in their mind. Yeah, it requires a lot of courage, but it needs the daily alternative to provide this backdrop of, outside of the 2% of mainstream politics, the political party agenda, if you like, this in the 98%, so many new ideas, initiatives, breakthroughs, examples of things working well. We're reporting that on a daily basis. So we've created our own media as an alternative to the mainstream media, and feel it's absolutely vital for people to be able to pull on lots of other people's examples and for themselves to develop this alternative narrative about the time we're in and what's possible for the future. So those 3 things operate together. It's a lot to be trying to do at the same time, but it's very chicken and egg. If we try to drop one of those things, then we ourselves will be falling prey to that siloed nature of things. We have to keep those 3 things in relationship to each other, and they involve very different networks of people. When we're doing those 3 different things, we've got a lot of different networks operating that we're trying to bring into view of each other. We give it a platform, and we're saying, you who are operating at this level, do you know these guys operating at this level within the narrative of people operating at this level? It's very ambitious, but we're finding a lot of resonance. And also the big thing I really should say is it's all we're really doing is bringing it together, because it's all of that is happening already. None of the things we feel need to happen are things that we have to invent. We're saying where there seems to be a vacuum, we're looking into that space and finding all these actors, but they just weren't aware of each other. So that's really revelation, in a way, is the main activity.
And through the revelation, the bringing of people together and making that narrative stronger?
Yeah, for themselves. Yeah, so when they see each other, they begin to create this narrative for their own part of that puzzle, right? So they may have thought they were operating in isolation, or they may have thought that they were the only thing that mattered. But when they start to see other people's takes on this or other perspectives, they begin to just get a bigger picture of what's possible. It's very energizing, in fact. Or people can ignore it. I mean, we've talked before, Amisha, about the impenetrability of silos. Some people at this point still just can't figure out the practices and the mechanisms of collaboration at all. That's, it's one of the biggest things I'm bumping into all the time. If you meet somebody else's practice, they say, oh, come into our space and do what you're doing in our space. But they can't also step out into each other's spaces. It's like there's only one space. It's hard. And again, I have to say, it's the women who are much easier, much more skilled at doing that because they've always had to do it.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. I want to come back to talking about the feminine aspects of all of this. But what you're talking about is soft power, which is something that I know you've done a lot of work on. Can you explain the difference between soft and hard power?
Yeah. It's quite evocative because even those terms are changing as we speak. But it's useful to take it to the beginning. It was a term coined by Joseph Nye, who works out of MIT and was an advisor to Bill Clinton. It came out of American politics at the time when America had just lost the war to Vietnam. There's lots of ways of describing that, but it was like the most powerful nation on the planet, having to withdraw from a tiny nation that had somehow defeated it, right? And it was a kind of existential panic for America when it saw that its hard power could not control the future. And in that very moment, Joseph Nye said, yeah, but America will always be great because of its soft power, right? And what is the soft power? So he described it as, instead of the power of force, it's the power of attraction. So because America is so attractive to people, they will always move towards America and want to be in relationship with America. And that's what gives America its power, right? So why do people keep moving towards the States? It was the power, not of their military, although that plays a role in it. It's the power of the American dream. It's the power of Hollywood. It's the power of the idea of meritocracy. It's the power of the ideas and of their culture and all the things that carry that. It's actually a picture and an understanding of how influence and storytelling is more effective and longer lasting than hard power, which is more interventional and can be overcome by perception changing. So at that moment, America was able to very effectively tell the story of why it hadn't succeeded in Vietnam in a way that still made America look like the leader of the free world, and it continued to do that. If you look at those two things as contrasting ways of acting, there's hard power continues its story. I'm not saying that hard power doesn't have, it's true. Force is effective. You can't deny that. And sometimes force is used for good things as well as bad things. It's not an evil in itself. It's just one way of operating. The other way of operating is through attraction, through influence, through storytelling, through framing. And since we've had the internet, that's shown its strengths much more. So you can take all sorts of examples. You might take, for example, the power of Mumsnet at some point on our elections. Just a group of mothers who came together, were able to be connected because of this new connectivity that we all have, became a power because of the story that they were telling, but it was only their own story, right? And they started off as just a group of women just getting together, and then it became an influence in our electoral cycle, so that all the politicians from each party think it's vital to be interviewed by the women on Mumsnet in order to get the women's vote. And that's an example of soft power. Another one at completely the other spectrum is, how did ISIS come to dominate our headlines in such a short space of time? That's also an example of soft power. The power of a video that captured everybody's attention, a horror video that captured everyone's attention, literally overnight changed the military spend of nations. People saw an enemy there that they'd never seen before.
So it can be soft power even if the content and the intention is violence?
Oh, absolutely. It's a mechanism. When people say, and it's very common now, people say, we need a new story, we need a new narrative, it's because they understand the nature of soft power. It doesn't have to be a good story. People with bad intent are using soft power as much as people with good intent. When you think of often I use the tool of, scissors, paper, stone. Stone is hard power, and scissors is a different form of hard power, but paper is the thing that wraps the stone, right? It can still be cut, by the scissors, but the paper is the soft power aspect of it. It can wrap a piece of stone and change its color, change its nature, change its, So if we're living in an age of soft power, it's not to say that therefore it's nicer. I'm afraid that nothing is that simple. When we're talking about power, it's a neutral space, but it gives a lot more people agency where they didn't have it before. For women, it's relevant because their story, which was hidden before, is now public and available to everyone. And that's changing everything. The Me Too phenomenon, for good or evil, is a soft power story. It's about, how a hashtag literally changed many people's lives and continue to change people's lives. So
and workplaces and everything.
Yeah, people's personal lives, their workplaces, how people gather, how companies are constructed. I mean, it's the power of a hashtag. Right? And that's something we could not have imagined 20 years ago, and still probably not even 10 years ago. It's now becoming much more obvious. And there's two sides of it. The one side is we need a new story now, right? And to hit the mark is not that easy, but when we have a new story, it'll be a way of connecting all of those projects which are currently disconnected. They'll come together in a sort of confluence of ideas. But the downside of it is that, it's fake news and other people's stories which are going to be competing all the time. And so there's always going to be this element of you have to know for yourself how to stand back from that. The storytelling, the narrative grace. Because that's, in a way, it's just another word for propaganda. It was always there. There's always been a story. It's just now we've got our hands on it. And even within that, even as you're telling your story, even as I'm telling you a story right now, you have to be able to step back from it and say, look at that story. Because sometimes it will be fake news. Sometimes it will be somebody harnessing your emotions. You have to be responsible for choosing the narrative you're going to go with now.
In the same way that advertising uses all these mechanisms, and so we have to be able to discern if this is a product that we really need or what part of us is really moved to need that product and have that clarity within us.
Absolutely.
Which is not easy with the amount of resource that goes into these narratives and these stories if they're coming from places that have financial power.
Absolutely, Amisha. You're telling a story there of our last 100 years. Where hard power was a real resource was to feed those mechanisms that in the end totally instrumentalized us. So yes, business wanting to dominate our public space hires the artistic community actually into the advertising industry, who used all of their skills and the scientific evidence of what people's emotional needs are. Think about the concentration of power there that harnessed the global population into a consumer life. We were persuaded that buying this stuff would give us status, belonging, even meaning and purpose. Remember those Coke ads? As long as you're drinking a can of Coke, you're part of the world wanting to sing together. I mean, it's very, very powerful. But at the same time, it's not evil in itself. It's how you then use that for what purpose. So if all we're doing is harnessing people's energies to keep a growth economy going, we should definitely be able to step back from that and say, I'm not drinking that can of Coke anymore. Because it's an addiction, actually. It's enslaving me to this economy, right? But then where do we go if we're trying to bring people together? We can't be against any form of advertising or storytelling as if it's anathema itself. It's just that we have to engage better with it. We have to learn how to stand back from it and actively choose which stories we're buying into, because that will never change, I don't think. If you've been a parent and you're bringing up your kids, you rely on storytelling. You rely on them believing what you're saying to bring them into their full potential. There's nothing bad about that. That is how we are as humans. Soft power has all this potential, but we have to be able to stand back and look at the story that's being told and say, I'm with that or I'm not buying into that, right? And this moment is me saying, I don't buy the political story that we are essentially divided, that we are essentially either on the left or the right, right? I don't buy that. And I'm stepping away from that story. And, I'm exercising the right to to tell a new story. And what you told me about being in your building is evidence and proof that we could go that way. And we're hearing that everywhere. Wherever we go to communities, people are yearning actually to come together. They have a right to come together in the face of this deliberate dividing.
I want to talk about the feminine, and I know that this is something that we could talk about for hours, as we have.
Yes.
What is the role of the feminine in all of this? And how do we bring more of the feminine, whether it's in women or men? But I think a lot of what we are talking about is more women coming out of the private space and into the public space with what they already know, what they're already doing, what they've already been cultivating.
Yeah, I mean, you've almost said it already, which is just that. We're in a historical moment. Sometimes I think, what is the real difference that we can make from moving out of the industrial era into another era altogether? And I feel it's the women coming into the public space that will make all the difference. And I'm hoping that men can see that too. And as they do that, they will also find a whole new way of being masculine within the feminine space. So just to unpack it a little bit more, that I don't problematize personally that historical development. That women were in the private space from hunter-gatherers onwards, and then made more, pushed further into the private space by the agrarian revolution and then the industrial revolution, is a historical fact. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing has been discussed for years, but I don't want to stay with the idea that it was all about women's disempowerment or their victimhood. It's also a story of incubation, that all the time that we were in that private space, we were the ones who were able to develop our internal wiring better, our self-understanding, our relationship capabilities. We were the ones who brought children up and made relationships in the community to allow our children to grow into society. We learned all that stuff, right? At a time when men were tasked to take on the public space, whether they were taking on nature, trying to defeat or overcome nature in the early days, or then later trying to make sense or trying to control probably a more globalized society. They were always out there doing the hacking work, if you like, of being in the jungle and clearing the space. So there were very different forms of operation. The imbalance of that has meant that male-dominated space has now become quite destructive. We spent too much time focusing on growth and production, a certain kind of creation that is destroying the planet. The public space has lost connection with the private space. And so now, I think it's our collective yearning as a human race that gave rise to the internet and allowed the breakdown of these divisions. And now there's more women moving into the public space and getting engaged with power. But they're bringing all their tools with them. They're bringing all their sensibility and their wiring with them. At the same time, maybe more men can move into the private space and make that, I don't know yet what it is that they're going to bring, but there's something about the father being more present at home, which will benefit the home itself. So there's an exchange really of places to operate and be more felt and seen. But from the point of view of the emergency, women being in the public space, I think will be the key to bringing it back into relationship with itself so that the ingenuity and the capability of human beings will start to become more active in engaging with the global problems we now face. It's very important that that's allowed to happen. And for me, it's still going too slowly. So it may be necessary for women to work together and encourage each other more to bring this era about.
There's a recognition that is so important, and yet it's also not easy. I know that we've both had personal experiences, and a lot of women that we know that are doing this work have had personal experiences, a lot of which they don't want to share publicly, about how challenging it can be to be in those environments, to not be able to sort of interrupt and butt in, to say your bit, to not even actually think in that way. So find those environments quite hard in which to access the wisdom and the knowledge. Yeah, exhausting and defeating it can feel. And I don't want to dwell in that part of the conversation, but as we do have men and women listening, I do want to share that that's part of the bumpiness of an evolution, and that it can lead to women questioning their place there, questioning their worth when they go into those rooms and find it hard to even open their mouths, that can then get turned inwards and become a, what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I'm not, maybe I shouldn't be there. But actually to acknowledge that that's always going to be part of this evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Our reality still, and certainly has been over the last 20 years, 30 years, let's face it, the last century probably, is that the women, it took a lot of courage and adopting of male behavior to enter into the masculine space. And there are many women who rightly pride themselves on having been able to intervene, possibly be better men than the men themselves. And most of our political leaders who are women have adopted that kind of stance. It's been very hard to champion the feminine in a really overly masculine cultured space. And some women have adapted brilliantly and made an intervention, but it's rare to be able to bring the feminine behavior with you. But they've seeded the way. They've sort of opened the space for more women to follow. And I think it's only now that women are beginning to come into public space as feminine entities, and it's still disputed. It's disputed amongst women that there is even such a thing as feminine. You and I are working on articulating that better and better to see the feminine and the masculine. Some people think about it as yin and yang, which is something else again, in my view. To see these two forces, which give rise to completely different mechanisms, as profoundly equal and therefore needing their equivalent space, right? But while it's still an overtly masculine culture in the public space, women need encouraging into that space, because it won't be balanced. It doesn't get balanced by just one woman at a time entering into a boardroom. It has to be on principle that we're looking to become more feminine. And I've been lecturing on this a little bit recently, and what really struck me, and we need to build this awareness more, is that men are suffering tremendously from the masculine public space. Right? So 95% of people in prison are men. Right? 75% of suicides are men. Right? So it's not good for them either. Right? We have to change the public space for everyone. And I think once those kind of facts are more obvious to men, they will be more actively looking for the people, in which case mostly women, who can help that, improve that. Not on these old ideas of what meritocracy is, which are mostly masculine ideas of what is good, right? But on new ideas of meritocracy. So we have to develop a new idea, a new meritocracy, if you like. And I don't even like the word meritocracy, but while we're still in this space, we have to use some of these old words. But what is valuable and what is needed has to be identified by all of us, and then try to bring that into the public space. And one of the things I'm finding all the time, Misha, is men who are actively looking for example, more network sensibility, more relational sensibility, more all these words that they think is new, is like a new thing, to become skilled at. It's already there with the women. The shortest and quickest way you're going to bring this stuff into your organizations is not by you going on courses. Just bring the women in.
Just ask them.
They're already there. They're already there.
Just ask them.
So you want to make a more connective organization? Have more women. It's that kind of almost practical set of actions need to become more popular.
And not just have them there, and not just ask them to, we need to now hear from the woman on the panel.
Yes.
Can we have a question from a woman in the audience?
Yes.
But actually really give them space and understand that their minds aren't necessarily so snappy, and it's a slightly different way of seeing a space, kind of figuring out what to do and then coming up with an idea, and actually allowing space for that. I love how you talk about how it's women as well as men that need to go on this journey. And I have a really crass example just to illustrate this a bit further, which is that a woman who is a mother with young children, who is an MP in our House of Parliament, said to me in confidence that when she joined Parliament, and she was obviously really excited, and she didn't come through a political route, so she was coming kind of having done a completely different career before, because wanting to give back. And some older MP women in Parliament who had been there for a long time, and they were talking, and they said to her, they found out that she had young children, and they said, oh, well, you're going to have to choose. You're going to be a bad mother or a bad MP.
Wow.
And it's like, what? 1 week in, that was just, wow. Yeah. That's the environment that I'm working in. No one would say to a man in the equivalent sense, are you going to be a bad father or a bad MP? The fact that in the center of our politics, that's a choice, and we don't understand that parenting is actually key to the future of our society.
Yeah, exactly.
I just illustrate that to say, like, this is how intense the problem is. And actually, when you were talking about empathy earlier on, that's the key here, that we can actually, rather than be like, oh, yes, yes, must hear from women. Oh, yes, yes, must embrace the feminine, but actually look around and be like, wow, what is it like for that person to be sitting in this room, actually?
Yeah. I mean, you conjure up such a huge vision of how it could be different. And we know that it can't be forced, but it can be awakened. I do know one or two MPs who are sort of awakened to that possibility. But the popcorn's not really popping fast enough, which is why I feel we need to make another one over here. You know, we're making an alternative because we want to model that from the outset. Until women themselves see themselves as not on the defensive anymore, that this is a new time, because we can't afford to think of ourselves as the weaker, you know, or the disempowered. We have to sort of have the courage to step into a space where we feel our power and embody it, and show compassion for the men. Because unless we feel our own power, we won't feel compassion, and then the men won't develop. Right? So it's quite a shift of stance for women that's on offer, which is why I feel it's important for women to spend time with each other and overcome their own narratives of their own weakness or neediness, or of course, all those things exist, but they exist alongside our incredible power. And it's the power we have to step into now for the sake of everyone, right? So we can't afford to make it about us any longer. We have to step into our power for the sake of everyone. And it sounds right. Some people will be rolling their eyes listening to this, but I know that there are women who are waiting for this moment to be able to do that. Not everyone can do that. Some women are absolutely victimized and disempowered. But even there, right, the time I've spent, for example, working in communities, we spent 2 years working with social workers as a project. The strength of those women, you know, even in the midst of the most horrendous public opprobrium around what a social worker is, these women were towers of strength for the people they were caring for. And they continued to be that. You know, so I think throwing the light on the strength of women who haven't been noticed before is a very important part of what we're doing. And there's nothing soft about it, actually. You know, this is where I would say soft power is stronger than hard power. You know, call me soft, but don't call me weak. You know, softness is about engagement, about subtlety. It's about connectedness. It's fluid. That's why it's soft, not because it's weak. So yeah, it's a real moment. It's a real moment. And I know some men. We both know some men who totally see the power of women, and they make it their business to bring that into the space. And those men have a very important role right now. Any man listening who recognizes that, I want to say thank you for having the courage to be a different kind of man who knows what's required right now.
Absolutely.
You know, you are precious.
We've had so many of them on this podcast.
Yes, yeah, and and honestly, Amisha, you're doing such a job of creating a feminine space into which men and women can step into equally. It's what we need right now. And then, you know, what the work that Ada Colau, for example, is doing in Barcelona on what she calls the feminization of politics is really key to all of this. It's happening at every level. I mean, if you and I could, would carry on talking for the next 3-4 hours, we'd end up feeling, oh, it's already here. But actually, in the moment we step outside of this bubble that we're in, even at this moment, we know it's not, and we have to. We're going to have to work very hard on it.
We're going to have to close, but I feel like a kind of summary of where we are is it's just everyone taking their defences down, allowing this process of moving into a new story to be fast. Us as women going, okay, yeah, all that happened, and yeah, it's been hard, but yeah, I'm here, I'm ready. Men, I guess, not being defensive about our history, because when we share our history, we're not sharing it to shame or to punish. We just have to explain ourselves, like what got us here and where we are. Like, that's it. It's not, we're kind of aware that that's just part of the story that had to happen to get to now. And the invitation for now is, let's all work together and let's bring our whole selves.
Absolutely. It's the information we didn't have before. And for that, we can thank all these men who created the capacity for that to be shared more widely. We're already in partnership, right? Thank you for what you're doing, because you're playing an enormous part in changing this narrative. And we've had a conversation here that I haven't been able to have somewhere else. And that's how it works. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, because I'm feeling energized and inspired and ready for the next chapter, to find an even a more sophisticated way of being part of the alternative. And I'm just so excited that you made the decision to do what you're doing now, and to create this space for everyone to come and share and join together in. We needed the alternative.
Hooray!
And it's here.
Yeah, the alternative. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
Thank you, Indra. So we'll share links to everything, of course, that we've mentioned, but your website is
www.thealternative.org.uk.
Brilliant. Until next time.
And let's make sure there is a next time.
Of course.
Great. Okay, thank you, Amisha.
Thank you. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?